Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by someone who recently was the one of the authors on a paper that kind of blew up on my Instagram, and it was looking at the barbell trajectory of international level weightlifters at a world level competition and then a Pan American competition. And a lot of people were really interested in that, and I thought who better to discuss the findings, the process of uh, getting that information and being able to share it than the person who did a lot of the work. And so the person I'm joined by today is Dr. Aaron Cunanan. How's it going, Aaron?
Doing well, Josh. Thanks for having me, man. I know we've been trying to get this set up for a while, so it's good to finally be able to get our schedules lined up and connect.
Yeah, and I think it's awesome we're able to do this. And I think sometimes the sports science world gets a bad rap in that people imagine guys in lab coats and in labs working on a lab bench doing some sort of research that's like so far removed from practice. Um, but you yourself, you've gotten a PhD, you've researched and written a lot about the sport of weightlifting and other aspects of strength and conditioning, and you're at the UFC Performance Institute, where you imagine it's like a lot of practice. So I think you're a person who kind of goes against the grain with the stereotype of someone in a lab coat doing work that's completely removed from what coaches will prescribe or try to implement, in a training session or during a training like macro cycle or something like that in preparation for a competition. Before we get into the details of the recent work that's been published, let's just kind of start with your background. I mean,
Sure.
what led you on the path to being, where you are today?
Yeah. Well, once upon a time, yeah. So my journey, uh, I guess, to get me to the point where I am now started probably over 10 years now at this point, down in Shreveport, Louisiana. So I used to be a weightlifter myself, not very good. I got a late start. And you know how that goes. But from being an athlete down in Shreveport, I was training under Dr. Kyle Pierce at his at the time was a USA Weightlifting Center for High Performance and Development, which he started after the '96 Olympics in Atlanta. So basically, put in a bid um, in partnership with LSU Shreveport to USA Weightlifting to open basically like a satellite training center that was focused on youth development at the time and was successful. Got the bid. One of the first people to come through that program to start that program, I think it was 11 or 12 at the time, was Kendrick Ferris.
Mm.
They had a number of other really talented lifters, Cody Gibbs being another individual. But basically, he grew that program from its start in '96, and kind of with that first crop of lifters that came up, having success at the junior level, and then moving on to the senior, and for Kendrick, making 3 Olympic Games. But along the way, picking up other lifters that joined at various points throughout their career. Um, so I was very lucky to be able to go down there to focus on training with the lifters at that time. And we had a crew when I was there. Back in 2009 is when I moved down. But shortly thereafter, we had people like Jared Fleming was there, um, Cameron Schwartz, Zach Schlender. We had a number of really high level women that were there: Megan Kranz, Sam Turnbull, Kara Heads had just finished up her weightlifting career before I got down there. So we had a lot of really awesome lifters. It was a pretty cool atmosphere. So, like I said, I got my start in coaching weightlifting down there. That's where I got to cut my teeth, was training along a lot of the top weightlifters in the country at the time, and with a lot of the youth that were coming in at that time still. And so got a really cool kind of glimpse, from people that were just getting their start to people that were, at the truly elite level, all across the spectrum from a weightlifting standpoint. So that was really neat. One of the really, I think, cool things of being down there was just Kyle's involvement with the International Weightlifting Federation and just weightlifting programs around the country and within Pan America. So I was able, very fortunate to get kind of a backseat view of his interactions with these programs, and we had camps and programs that would come in from other countries for periods of time. The Colombia national team came in several times. The Canadian national team would come in. We had a team from Japan that would come in every year. So being exposed to those people in person and those athletes and those coaches, but then also hearing, of Kyle when he would go to IWF meetings and things like that, talking with those coaches, just seeing the background of the coaches at these successful programs and Kyle's background himself, with a doctorate within, some human performance related field, um, was something that I definitely noticed that was very different from a lot of the coaching background and resumes of the top coaches in the U.S. And that's not to say that you need, a big degree to be a good coach. But I think that if you look at the success of international programs, a large part of it is due to the systematic nature of these programs and the careful and detailed planning of not just the training but all the other aspects from the nutrition, the sports psych, to like long-term athletic development, like a true LTAD model that they're able to implement, and those sorts of things. So I got a very, what I would say is a very nuanced view of training for high level sport and for Olympic sport. We had, like I said, Kendrick Ferris and several others that had Olympic dreams and were um, at least competing and training to make Team USA for things like Pan Ams and World Championships. So that gave me a very deep appreciation for the careful nature that you should approach training and planning with, and also kind of formed my early vision of what I wanted to achieve as a coach. And so for me, my initial like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed dream was to be the next great American weightlifting coach, and kind of looking at Kyle's program and some of these other programs, like I kind of had a skeleton framework for what I thought I would need to be able to have a chance at replicating similar success myself in the future. And so, like I said, a lot of that included just more better education, to help my coaching ability and my ability to plan training effectively. And so that kind of led me down the path and being interested in sports science. As a coach, it's one thing to use sports science, whether it's consulting the literature for with weightlifting. It's pretty easy to do a Google Scholar search and get a lot of hits on biomechanics and weightlifting technique and those sorts of things, which I definitely read. A lot of those papers, or all of those papers that are relevant from a training standpoint, looking at if you're trying to drive this specific adaptation. Um, so at that period in my development, my interaction with sports science was more as a consumer of, trying to consult the literature and see the pertinent findings and being able to apply those as a coach. And started to get to a point where the research couldn't answer some of the questions I had. And I lacked the skills to be able to answer some of those questions myself, whether they were, subtle differences in like programming this way versus that way, how that affects training outcomes, whether it's like more comprehensive or detailed biomechanical analysis to evaluate technique, those sorts of things. Like there are obvious gaps and holes in my skill set and my knowledge to be able to use that stuff effectively, or to be able to continue to advance my abilities as a coach. And so, that tied to, like I said, kind of that framework that I had for what it would take to be a successful coach led me down the path of wanting to pursue more education. So I finished my master's degree down there under Kyle, and then was looking at PhD programs. And like I said, my kind of interaction or role within sports science at that point in time was more so as a consumer. But I recognized a big gap um, within my own skill set from being someone who can conduct a study or investigate a research question myself. And so that was a large motivation for selecting the PhD program that I did go to, which was at East Tennessee State University, where I studied under Dr. Mike Stone and the rest of the faculty members there. Um, And so my motivation for choosing the ETSU program, like I said, was to gain some of those technical skills, being able to get a more intimate experience with the research process itself. On the other side, before something goes to publication, you have to run the study. You have to, identify the research question. Figure out how you're going to measure and test those things, figure out the statistical analysis that's relevant, and then interpret the results and write up the conclusion and figure out what the practical applications are. Um, so that was definitely a large part of what I sought to get out of the time that I had at ETSU. Also, just gaining experience with some of the different tools and technologies that are more common now these days, things like force plates, motion capture, velocity based training, with linear position transducers, which are the device that you use to measure bar speed if you attach the tether to it, and all those sorts of tools and toys. And then also just to learn under the brilliant minds there, so Doc Stone is considered by a lot of people to be like one of the forefathers of periodization in the United States, and is definitely one of the leading, minds with regard to periodization, strength and power development, within the global community as well. And we had other amazing faculty there. Satoshi Mizuguchi, who was the head weightlifting coach, amazing biomechanist and statistician. We had Kimi Sato at the time. Brad Deweese was there. Meg Stone, who has her own amazing career as an S&C coach. So it was an amazing place to be able to spend time learning under these people that had some really top level experience both within sports science and within strength and conditioning. So I was very fortunate to kind of develop my skills first as a coach, because I was an assistant coach for the weightlifting program there during my time, but then also as a sports scientist, actually doing and practicing sports science, and then as a researcher as well, kind of conducting some of these studies, the study that you mentioned at the top of the show. Um, and so that kind of that experience, and as I just continued to develop as a coach, gaining a broader perspective for high performance sport, what my role could be within that landscape. Started to look beyond just weightlifting, looking at where sport in the US was headed. You're starting to see more and more quote unquote high performance programs or high performance departments with quote unquote high performance directors, sports scientists being hired, and most of these people were coming from overseas. Um, but I recognized very early on, when I was still in Shreveport, that this was only going to gain momentum, and these things were only going to become more prominent. And so, as I kind of evaluated what I wanted to do and take on a broader role within sport, not just as a coach, gaining that experience as a sports scientist, being interested in being able to orchestrate from a broader overview and being involved with more components of the training process, not just the strength and conditioning or the physical preparation side of things, but being able to be in a position to help manage that aspect, and then the nutrition and the sports med and the sports psychology. So I kind of shifted my focus a little bit more toward that route, um, which I was very fortunate to be able to, um, you know, to pursue that and to land positions that would allow me to continue moving down that career pathway. Part of it was luck and good timing, and part of it was just careful planning and foresight, and trying to make sure that I identified the skills that I would need and the things that I would need to do, and making sure that I achieved those things to put myself in those positions for when those opportunities came up to at least be in the running. And then was fortunate enough to be able to, coming out of the PhD program, land a role with the San Francisco Giants. So it's the baseball Giants, as their sports science coordinator last year for through 2020. And then the end of last year, this position that I'm currently in with the UFC Performance Institute as the performance support manager came up, and transitioned into that role at the beginning of the year. So that's kind of a long-winded way to encapsulate my journey from my days in Shreveport as a low weightlifting athlete and beginning coach to where I am now.
Yeah, and I'd like to revisit some of those time points, but one thing that I've kind of wondered, because I've had many interactions with you before this podcast, is what exactly you do at the UFC Performance Institute. Because I'm kind of familiar with Bo Sandoval. I know, uh, directly talking to Colin Burns and kind of indirectly talking to people about Bo.
Mhm.
I know he's at the UFC PI and he's got some involvement there with the strength and conditioning aspect of it. So, what do you do on a day to day basis? What kind of role do you fulfill?
Yeah. So here at the PI, so we have all of our departments. So Bo, as you mentioned, he's the director of strength and conditioning. We have sports med slash PT, nutrition, sports psych, sport science, and then so each of those departments has a director and then
Mm.
staff underneath them. And then we have our VP of athlete development, who's Forrest Griffin,
Oh, cool.
and Duncan French is our VP of performance. And the directors and their staff, their role at whatever they fulfill as whether it's a PT, AT, S&C coach, dietitian, they're fulfilling the needs and interactions with the fighters and providing services to the fighters on a day-to-day basis and kind of running their departments. And you have Duncan, who's kind of over the whole thing and is also a conduit between the Performance Institute side and then the UFC, larger business side of things. And then I kind of maintain a space in the middle to help kind of um, maintain an overview of the daily operations. And we have a roster of over 600 athletes. I think it's like 640 athletes, and that's a global roster, right? Like less than 10% or less than 5%, I think, actually live in Las Vegas.
Mm.
So a lot of our interactions are they're either remote or they're when athletes are in for a fight at the Apex, or they come in for a visit, at some point during their training, whether it's off camp or they have a fight signed and they're coming in for camp. And that visit could be anywhere from a couple of days to several months or anywhere in between. And fighters will engage with any of the departments, um, or any combination of the departments for service. And a large part of my role, again, is just kind of coordinating that to make sure that our engagement and support of the fighter is as comprehensive and coherent as possible, right? So it's not just they're working with S&C and sports med and nutrition separately. It's like how are our
Mm.
services within each of those departments aligning toward our overall strategy of supporting the fighter. So trying to remove those silos that you typically see or often see in some organizations, and just trying to create a comprehensive and truly integrated approach to the planning and performance for our fighters.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds. I'm sure a lot of people listening, because because UFC and mixed martial arts is such a popular sport now and gaining
Mhm.
even more traction quickly. A lot of people, I think, are thinking to themselves, "That sounds like a dream job."
It's
Uh,
pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, it's awesome walking into work every day for sure. It's a pretty fun environment to work with. I mean, the population is just a really great population to work with. I think the combat sport community and like martial arts communities in general, um, I think there's a certain ethos that
mm,
they carry with them, but they're all super appreciative. They all work insanely hard. A lot of times it's not trying to get them to work hard. It's how can they focus that energy in a productive way rather than just running into the wall and running themselves into the ground. So they're super awesome to work with, and it just is unlike any other sport or league, where it's just so dynamic, right? In any any other sport, NFL, NBA, whatever, there's a set season, right? And every team, every player within that organization, within that sport, is under the same schedule, right? You have the same off season, same preseason, same season. You know when your games are going to be. But here, like I said, a roster of over 600 fighters, you could have a fight scheduled, with less than a week's notice. You could have a fight scheduled several months out, and then that fight date could change the day of, right? It could either get canceled or your opponent gets injured that week, so your fight date gets pushed back. or moved up or whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of chaos in this environment, but that's part of what makes it fun and challenging and exciting is like how do we solve those problems, and take the expertise of everyone that we have on staff and find effective ways to deal with those challenges.
I'm sure that can be a challenge, especially if someone coming from a background that's really influenced by existing information that details like specific timelines for adaptation,
Sure.
specific timelines for
Yeah.
types of training, and like, and I think that's what a lot of people kind of the concern or one of the things people often bring up when they talk about block periodization, is how rigid it comes off as, and how there's an inflexibility and it's not suited to an individual. And kind of hear that same thing when people reference studies and science kind of as a whole, is it's looking at an average. And of course it's like, you always hear that, and people like, I think people concede that everyone's not average and there's going to be some variation. But working with fighters who can take a fight, within a week's time or have 6 months until the fight, I think that challenges inflexibility. um, so do you find it really takes some sort of bridge from theory to practice to be able to be in that position and to be able to support fighters who don't adhere to really any timeline? Or is there something that I'm missing when I frame the question that way?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. 100%. That's a really good question. I will start by saying that you mentioned periodization, block periodization, um, or I guess even traditional periodization gets characterized as being really inflexible, which to me is just an inaccurate characterization. Like it's just a mischaracterization of periodization. Um, you know, if you go back and read even some of the classical like texts, there's nothing that says it has to be this period, a block has to be this many, weeks long. Like there are guidelines, you have to work out at this intensity during this week or this day. Um, and, your point about going from theory to practice, periodization is just about providing the framework for how you identify, all right, what are our performance objectives? How much time do we have? Whether that's, a week, a month, a year, 4 years. Okay, well, based off of that, what can we achieve from a physiological adaptation or physiological response? Like obviously, within a week or 4 weeks, that's a very small window that doesn't allow the opportunity to develop much, if anything at all. So, okay, well then, what would our
Mhm.
objectives be? Um, Probably a lot of fatigue management because if you're that close to the competition, you don't want to impose too much stress to where they arrive at the competition and they're just in a super fatigued state and they're not recovered, and able to express their performance abilities. Versus if you have a longer runway, then okay, now we can take these general ideas of it. Takes roughly this amount of time to develop physiological adaptation X, Y, Z, and it makes the most sense to sequence them or fit them together this way. Okay, now we can start to plug in the programming. So that's a little tangent. You got me fired up there. There is a really good paper that Doc and a few others just published in JSCR, which is a really comprehensive deep dive into not only the history of periodization, but addresses some of these other misconceptions directly head on. So I definitely encourage the listeners to take a look through that. Um, but anyway, to get back to your point about within our world, right, with such dynamic timelines and like historically or traditionally, fighters, you know, to them, training was you have an 8 week camp. Like if you don't have a fight booked, then you're not training basically. Like so that means they let their weight get out of control. Their physical development is they're basically detraining,
Mhm.
and then they get a fight signed, roughly 8 weeks out, and it's like, okay, now we're gonna start training, and they may have to crash diet to get their weight down, which means that even if they wanted to focus on performance, that's probably not going to be very effective. And so, a large part of the focus for the Performance Institute, especially early on, is that education piece and trying to influence the culture and the practices of the fight community, to where you're not just an 8 week athlete, you're a
Mm,
365, 24/7, 365 athlete. That's not to say that you don't have downtime or you take time off, but you're not just sitting on the couch, letting your weight get out of control and detraining if you don't have a fight book, right? So you're still trying to maintain some level of preparedness, and fitness in between fights. So for us, I think the way to apply the periodization concept, and kind of getting at your point of like this notion that it's inflexible, or like how do you accommodate these fractured timelines, to make something like periodization effective or useful in that setting. It just goes back to just like you had planned for any sport, like what's important
mm,
from a performance standpoint. I think in sports like MMA, and especially coming from baseball, like I think those are two sports that are very skill dependent, right? You can be, not have the strongest numbers in the weight room, but if you connect with somebody on the chin, like in the right spot, that's lights out, regardless of how quote unquote strong you might be, right? Or if you make the wrong move, you could be in the best shape of your life. Your weight was on point the whole time. You had an easy weight cut, and you make the wrong move and you get clipped, and then you're the one that's knocked out, right? So it's just so dynamic, and such an open environment within the octagon itself as well, to where, kind of taking a step back and looking at what's important, um, you know, we can make a case for why strength might be important for different
mm,
aspects of endurance or bioenergetics, why you might want to focus on those sorts of things, from a weight management and weight cutting standpoint. Like we can make a, I think, a strong argument for why you should focus on some of those things. And then, like I said at the start, depending on what your timeline is, that's going to dictate what is actually realistic or feasible to achieve within that timeline. And going back to the point of trying to influence the culture to get these athletes to be more 24/7, 365, switched on as professional athletes. When you take that approach, even if you're not in quote unquote competition shape, well, it's a hell of a lot easier to get closer to competition shape if you're maintaining your training than if you're just allowing yourself to completely detrain when you're not booked for a fight and you're just waiting for that 8 week period, right? And so it's kind of, you know, there's some trade-offs for sure, but it's like how do you, and this word gets thrown a lot around a lot, how do you optimize the situation? Well, optimization isn't like making things perfect. It's
mm,
about making the best out of the cards that you're dealt, right? So given parameters XYZ, we only have this much time to prepare. We were coming off of this specific block or phase in training, and our timeline to the fight is like 5 weeks. Well, it doesn't make sense to focus on this. We should focus on that. And so it's just about taking a realistic stock of what all the parameters and constraints are, and prioritizing, right? Not just prioritizing what we're doing from a physical preparation standpoint, but you got to prioritize what you're doing from a skill development standpoint. That's a conversation we have with fighters a lot too, right? Where it's mixed martial arts. So there's grappling, there's wrestling, and everything in between. And so you may have fighters that some days they have 3 or 4 different just MMA related practice sessions. Well, not all of them can be high quality or high intensity. And then if you think of 7 days a week, they're doing MMA practice 4, 5, 6 days a week. How do you prioritize? What are your high quality technical skill focused sessions? What are your, you're trying to develop, fight specific conditioning or MMA specific conditioning. Um, how do you balance those and structure your week to accommodate those things? So, again, a long-winded answer to get back to your point. It's just all about identifying what the parameters and constraints are, identifying what the priorities and the objectives are, and then figuring out what the best solution is. It's not about like it has to fit. We have to spend 3 weeks or 4 weeks on this. We have to spend 4 weeks on this. It's like, okay, well, we have 4 weeks. We only
mm.
have 4 weeks to focus So what are we going to focus on during that time? So yeah, I mean, there's definitely the need for, I think, the stronger background and understanding you have of those theoretical frameworks, and then also of like the physiological responses and kind of the science side of things, that enables you as a coach to practice the art more effectively and to tailor what you do, in a more precise way for whatever the circumstances.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about timelines, and that I kind of sticking around that idea of block periodization, training certain fitness qualities over a certain span of time, where it seems to be one, the time allocated, given that if you have 24 weeks, you're not going to spend the entire 24 weeks working on one thing. You're probably going to divide it up,
Mhm.
and focus on certain qualities, and put some on the back burner. But with the theory, I think with like a lot of the work that's kind of been handed down, so like work from Isserin and work from other kind of bigger figures in the periodization field, a lot of that was theoretical, or kind of born out of scarcity of research. Or in certain sports, I know I've seen some stuff looking at like kayaking and block periodization, and people would look at that and say, how does it apply to weightlifting or some other sports? Do you think now that there's been more research coming out of the pipeline, and you've been contributing to this to some extent, that the concept, or the theory behind focusing on certain blocks of just strength development and having some sort of like secondary focus, or focusing on muscle hypertrophy and having a secondary focus, that's being borne out by research coming out? Or is it being um, I guess, is research supporting block periodization, given what we know, what you've looked at, because you're probably more well read than a lot of the listeners and myself. So maybe you can give us an update on where we're at with that, if research seems to support or contradict those concepts.
Sure. So I
It's
think
a lot there.
partly, yeah. So I think the research that's being done in recent research, um, it it's partly supportive of the periodization concept, and I say partly because it's very hard to conduct, like, doing studies is very hard. It's very difficult. One, just like recruiting subjects. Two, like you said, you know, just being able to conduct a study over long enough of a period of time. So a lot, and this is where some of the criticism of periodization comes from, is a lot of studies are only 4 to 8 weeks long, which isn't long enough for one periodized cycle, right? So um, I think the support for periodization, the periodization concept, is borne out more from just indirect inferences
Mhm.
based off of um, individual studies or individual areas of research looking at strength development, power development, those sorts of things. And then the second part is a lot of the research that would be classified as periodization research are actually looking at differences in programming strategies,
Mhm.
right? So it's, you know, we're going to do this set and rep scheme, but we're going to do this, see how it compares to doing that same rep scheme to failure. Well, those are two, slightly subtly different things. Like, you're, I won't dive into like just why you shouldn't train to failure in most cases within a sport performance context, but like those are not the same thing necessarily as periodization, right? So periodization, and wrote this in a review on general adaptation syndrome and periodization that I've written, and then in Doc's recent paper, and it's in countless other places, right? So periodization is like just the concept or the framework for dividing up whatever timeline of preparation you have and how you assign the training objectives, to those timelines. The programming is okay based off of these training objectives. What physical training stimulus can I provide to achieve objective X or adaptation X, Y, or Z? Um, And so when you look at things that, investigate, the effects of these two training interventions on strength or these two training interventions on power, again, those are dealing with programming, the effects of programming variables rather than, all right, if we have this period of time and I want to target, strength endurance, then basic strength, then power versus I want to target power, then, strength endurance, then strength. That's more toward investigating the effects of periodization, right? Because it's periodization deals with how you not only are you dividing the timeline that you have given to you and identifying the training objectives, but how are you sequencing those objectives as well? Um, so that's why I say the periodization only partly supports periodization because it's very hard to do studies that actually get at the heart of periodization. Now, there's a lot of really high quality case reports on periodization itself. So if you look at, there's a lot of information being published from places like Norway and other places within Scandinavia where they take, very detailed records of the training process. They have a very comprehensive approach to training, especially for their Olympic sports. But they've published things of, I can't remember the woman's name, but she's like the most successful biathlon athlete ever, and they like published the entire history of her Olympic career, like her training program throughout that whole Olympic career, and they've published additional reports on other athletes and sports as well, and you're seeing that within swimming, coming out of Spain, and so you're starting to see, and so they're not intervention studies per se, where like you're doing an experiment to compare the effects of two groups, but you're at least getting a very detailed report of well documented. This is what we did. This is how we sequence things. Um, and so you might not be able to generalize it, to the wider group, but you at least start to gain some better understanding of why certain decisions were made with regard to how they planned and how they structured the training process, and then kind of some of the programming to support that. So I don't know if I answered your question or opened up another can of worms, but yeah.
Well, there are plenty of questions branching off of that. I guess where I'll take it is so you mentioned, periodization is the almost like the overarching ability to break a timeline down and to structure it in a way that's going to maximize performance on a competition date. So it's kind of the planning aspect, and then you have the programming aspect. And you think so. Someone might be thinking, well, why would it be sequenced in a very specific way, like strength, endurance, strength, and then power? And my understanding is that the research supporting that specific sequence would, one, try to show that the strength endurance phase would bleed over into the strength phase, which would bleed over into the power phase. But also, detraining studies would say, well, this fitness quality tends to last longer and would need to be stoked less than another fitness quality that might degrade quicker, right? So we're talking
Mhm.
about like training residuals.
Right.
Are those aspects also relatively well supported? Like I know there's a lot of detraining stuff. The populations aren't ideal. And of course it's kind of not specific to the programming aspect of periodization, but it does support maybe that strength tends to stick around, like maximal strength
Sure.
tends to stick around longer when measured very specifically.
Sure.
So again, then we're kind of getting away from the actual tool we're going to be using to improve maximal strength, which might be a back squat. They're looking at something like a leg press or leg extension. So I mean, a lot of differences there, but do you think the research is still supportive of how you would break down the different parts of the timeline and then how you would structure it?
Yeah. So there's a few layers to that, but in a word, yes, I do think that the research does support that. From the sequencing aspect, you mentioned one possible sequence is like strength endurance to strength to power. Um, I think that there's there are good studies out there that support that basic sequence. If power or similar characteristics are the end goal or are the most important goal that you're trying to achieve. Um, And there may be cases where it's like a more the target is a more endurance based activity that might necessitate a different structure or sequence. But in my assessment of the literature, I think that there is enough evidence, at least for me, to confidently say yes, that basic structure or sequence is probably ideal in most circumstances. Um, and then from the standpoint of like training residuals, I think this again it goes back to it's more so from an indirect standpoint
Mm,
of like understanding the specific decay of fitness quality X, whether it's strength or aerobic capacity or whatever the case may be. Um, like I think there's enough research on those areas individually to have enough like to have a reasonable idea enough to like make a plausible case for why you would sequence things that way. And I think there's some good emerging research in terms of like the use of maintenance or retaining loads to maintain a fitness quality, minimizing detraining and all that sort of stuff. Um, so I think, you know, again, some of it is rather indirect, but again, part of science is, you only have X, this body of literature or knowledge available to you, and that is the best, highest quality information that you have available at the time. In addition to your coaching experience and some of that stuff as well, like you have to be able to evaluate and make a decision based off of whatever information you have to you. It'd be nice to have better studies or to have more direct studies, but we don't. So
mm,
we still have to make decisions as
yeah.
coaches, right? And so I think that goes back to one of the criticisms of you know periodization is that um, people will like basically it doesn't matter what you do, like just specificity, just train specific to the needs or whatever. But like if you've ever trained for any number of weeks, like just trying to hit singles or doubles, like that sucks. And at at some point in time, that's just not going to be feasible for you anymore. So like whether it's a sport like weightlifting where you have a very specific like precise outcome that you're trying to do, or if it's a team sport where you have a lot of other different fitness qualities, um, from a practical standpoint, it's just not practical to do the
Mm,
same thing or to focus on everything all at the same time for the entire time. So from a practical standpoint, you need to periodize your plan. And if you want to be more deterministic about it and say, okay, I'm going to do this during this time, followed by this, because I think that's the best sequence, you know, you're still periodizing to some extent. So,
Yeah, I think the problem we often run into is that things just get painted so black and white, and I don't imagine anyone would say, "Hey, because we have this perfectly laid out plan, it doesn't mean shouldn't deviate from it or should deviate from it." Um, or that because we're focusing on building the muscle size, we're not going to do any snatching or clean and jerking because it's not an efficient way to do that. I don't think anyone ever paints it that black and white in practice. But those are some of the common criticisms is, well, they're just focusing on tens and it's not, it's not doing X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, in practice, that probably looks a lot different from an example laid out in a textbook. And that's one thing I wanted to pick your brain on is back when you were at Shreveport with Kyle Pierce, what was that experience like from a coaching perspective? Like, what did you gain from that supplemented the theoretical knowledge you ended up gaining in graduate school later on?
yeah, I think one of the biggest like, light bulb moments, for my time down in Shreveport, and I was there for 7 years. Like the basic structure of the program was the same basic structure of the program since 96 up until now. Like he's still using the same basic structure in terms of how many days a week, the heavy and light days, kind of the block style approach, the exercise variation between the blocks. You know, there's room to individualize exercises, for whether it's for an athlete or if you've been doing the program for, say you've run 3 cycles. Okay, now we're gonna, introduce a different variation of, a horizontal row, to get some variety in there, stuff like that. But the fact that he was able to continually have success year after year, like Kendrick was still hitting PRs in 2016, the last year he competed. Like, that's incredible, right? Like, from 96 to 2016, like running the same basic program, having, I don't think he had any like major injury that required surgery or anything over his entire career. Um, and this dude was still setting PRs, you know, at the very end of his career. And then same thing for the other athletes that came in, that they either had a really high training history or even the athletes that had, training age of 0. Like, they were all still making progress and consistently made progress, off of the same basic program. And so, like, to me, it just reinforced that, like, this style of programming, it works. This, gave me appreciation for not making things more complicated than they have to be, which a lot of people like to do. But yeah, I think that was the biggest thing, is like, it it works. Like, as simple as that. And it works across the spectrum of individuals. Now, yes, it's for the sport of weightlifting, which is, very, I guess, um, one of the more simpler of sports that you would have to prepare for in terms of like the physical qualities that you're trying to target and develop. But, going to ETSU and seeing the same model applied to other sports, not just individual sports or, like very targeted sports, like for bobsled athletes, working on, acceleration and sprint development and stuff, to help improve their ability to push the bobsled at the start. Track and field athletes, but also the team sport side of things. Like, it, yeah, I think from a very practical standpoint, like, if you just take a step back and look, and there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. Like, I'm not
Mhm.
saying that you have to program that specific way. Kyle's program, there are versions of it floating around on the internet. It's like the tens, fives, threes template, right? Like, what? But yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It's actually funny you say that because I worked with Glenn Pendlay for a long time and I had a lot of conversations with him, and it's his squat program was the exact same for every person, and he was almost adamant to not change it. He's like, we do 5 sets of five, we'll do 3 sets of 3 in the front squat, and then we'll do 1 set of 5 at the end of the week. And I think eventually he like somehow convinced himself to transition to threes, and that was like that was a huge moment for him, and
uh,
it was 20 years in the making of transitioning from fives to threes, and then I think he was like experimenting with doubles. But yeah, it is funny that something can and last for so long and work so effectively, and yeah, just kind of it's an ode to simplicity to some extent. Then as you transitioned to ETSU and got more, you got exposed more to the research side of things. How did that influence or change the way you thought about weightlifting specifically? Um, one, either conducting studies, but also being exposed to more and more research.
sure. Um, I think a I grew a lot at ETSU from the standpoint of being able to understand on a deeper level why things were effective, why the program was effective, being able to investigate on a more granular level if things were actually
Mhm.
effective or if it's just, you perceive things how you want them to be. So we have a pretty comprehensive athlete monitoring program at ETSU for all the sports, but especially for weightlifting, to where at the end of every block, um, the athletes will do, um, jump testing. So we'll do squat jumps from loaded from 0 kilos up to 20 kilos, and then counter movement jumps from 0 to 20 kilos, and then the isometric mid thigh pull.
Hmm.
Um, and those are all on force plates. So we're getting very detailed, robust information from the standpoint of like how these athletes are producing and expressing force in ways that are very relevant directly to actual weightlifting movements. Um, Kept very detailed records of their volume load throughout their training cycles, the intensity as well. Obviously, tracking their competition performances. So all of that information together, and then we also did things like we had ultrasonography machines. So we basically took ultrasound images of their quad to look at muscle thickness and cross sectional area over the course of a training cycle. Um, so you're able to see, okay, if we're trying to stimulate hypertrophy, or if we know that we're entering a low volume phase, so you're not stimulating hypertrophy as much, are we actually losing muscle?
Hmm.
Um, how does that correspond to any of the performance changes we might see on the force plates? We're getting that deep level information, like are actually able to understand if the training program is doing what we're saying it's doing, or if we're just saying BS and you need to find a different story, right? But like I said, we were able to corroborate a lot of those things, and even stuff like subjective wellness ratings. We did some studies with that. So part of our ability to kind of ask and investigate these questions, um, the program at ETSU is what I would say is probably a lot more controlled than you might find elsewhere. Um, for a lot of reasons. But we were able to collect this information on a consistent basis to a high quality. But to your point, you still need to actually conduct the study. And a lot of times, sports science research or strength and conditioning research gets criticized because people say, oh, whatever is published, coaches have already been doing for a few years or several years or whatever. It's not answering anything new, or it's not answering anything that's directly relevant that to the coaches. Um, and I think part of that criticism is slightly unfair because being on that other side of it, actually trying to do these studies, takes a lot of time, just from the standpoint, like administrative standpoint. In order to conduct a study, you have to submit approval to the Institutional Review Board or the IRB, um, which basically any subject that involves humans for the sake of ethics requires approval from an IRB. And that process itself can take several months, if not longer, just to get your study approved. Then you have the recruiting process, and people drop out of the studies, and um, things like that. So there's a lot of things that can get in the way of just getting the study off the ground. But even once you do conduct the study and you want to submit it for publication, um, writing is difficult, as several of many of the readers might be experienced with trying to read something, and it's like, what the hell are they saying? Like, this is so complicated. Like, writing a good, like, clear paper is very hard. Writing is not something that comes naturally to a lot of people, and especially scientific writing. So that can be a challenge. But once you submit for publication, you have to submit, you have to wait for it to be assigned to reviewers, and then you have to wait for the reviewers to provide their feedback and revisions. You have to make those revisions. You can have several rounds of that process, and each stage of that can take a few weeks to several months itself. And like I said, you could have multiple stages of revision where you have 2 or 3 rounds. Um, so just getting the study off the ground and just getting that study published, you could have close to a year or longer on for both of those aspects of it, not to mention actually conducting your study. So, like I said, I do think it's a little bit unfair sometimes when people criticize like the timeliness of research that coaches have been doing this for years. Well, yeah, probably, but it also took years to do this study and get it to see the light of day. Um, so that's part of it. but then also just time, right? Like in the academic setting, faculty members, they're teaching full course loads. They got, a bunch of other stuff, and sometimes things like funding, just other research projects that they're involved with, uh, you know, grant proposals and stuff like that. Their time is they can't just devote all their time to pet projects or things that they're interested in. Excuse me. So, those are some of the challenges with conducting studies. But to get back to our ability to publish what I think are high quality actual training studies. Um, we do have a controlled setting. Um, I think part of it also comes from having a background as a coach myself. Like those, I think researchers that have coaching or practical experience before moving into the research space bring a, a valuable perspective from the standpoint of really being able to hone in on pertinent questions for practitioners and being able to ask research questions in a way that are going to be impactful for practitioners. For example, my dissertation, as you mentioned, was a study of the 2015 World Championships, 2017 Pan Am Championships, um, analyzed over I think 319 lifts of the snatch between both competitions. So part of my motivation was one to extend the findings of the pretty robust biomechanics weightlifting literature going back to the 70s. There hasn't been that large scale of a study in quite some time. So I wanted to see one, what's technique changing? And if so, what does that mean for coaches? But secondly, when I did my master's degree, there's a software program called Canovia that had recently come out, which is a free open source video analysis software. Um, and this was when smartphones were already popular, but becoming more popular and more capable. They all had cameras on those things were getting pretty good, and especially now, most of them shoot high speed, high definition. Um, so from the standpoint of historically, a lot of the weightlifting literature is based off of video analysis, which back in the 70s and 80s, that was very time consuming. It was like manually plotting,
Mhm.
where the bar was during each frame, connecting the dots, and then providing coordinates for it. Versus now, like you can pretty much automate that process with a program like Canovia. Again, it's free. Everybody has a smartphone these days. Um, so there's the potential that coaches now have access to a very powerful, robust, technique analysis tool. And so part of the motivation for my study was to demonstrate the feasibility of implementing high volume technique analysis for the weightlifting movements. So I was very deliberate in using Canovia because it's free and open source. There's a similar program called Dartfish, which is like several $1,000s just for a single license. So that's cost prohibitive for a lot of people. Um, and then from the standpoint of the methodology of, we took a single camera, put it on the side to get a view of the barbell trajectory directly from the side uh, during competition. So very practical. You could translate that to the training hall. If you have a platform that's set up, you could set up the camera in the same spot every time. If all right, we want to do technique analysis on you this day, you're lifting on this platform, and you have the setup ready to go. Um, and then the software itself took just a few seconds to actually analyze the trajectory, and you can spit out a bunch of variables from peak velocity, vertical displacement, horizontal displacement, all this other stuff. So for me, again, going back to trying to have a practical impact, because I came from a coaching background, so I wanted to um, update kind of the scientific knowledge around elite weightlifting technique and kind of the implications for coaches, but then two, also demonstrate a feasible method for coaches that may want to implement trajectory analysis. You could directly take the method section from the study published for my dissertation and run with it and apply it to your setting. I even provide guidelines as sort of like how far does the camera have to be, how high does the camera have to be, that sort of stuff. Like so, it's all in my eyes reasonably practical. Like, sure that you're not going to do trajectory analysis on every lifter every day, on every lift. Um, and there are some other things that you might have to do from like the processing standpoint. But like for me, that was a large motivation for my dissertation project. And then same for some of the other studies, some of the training studies that we've done, looking to validate the specific wellness questionnaire that we use. So we had the athletes fill out this wellness questionnaire. It's called the stress recovery, the short recovery and stress scale. It's 8 questions, been validated in other athlete populations. So we had our athletes filling it out during the entire training process. We, did all our athlete monitoring, and then the last block, so the peaking and tapering block, we also had them jumping on force plates uh, nearly every day. But then we also brought the force plates with us to the competition to get jumps the day of competition. Like, so that whole week that we were there, all the way, including the day of competition. So we can see the correspondence between their wellness questionnaire responses and their actual physical performance. Now, sure, it's not the physical performance measure wasn't the snatch or the clean and jerk. Like, we looked at compared their PRs as well, but we have something that corresponds pretty closely, based off of historical research to the weightlifting movements. So we can see the correspondence between the subjective wellness and their actual performance ability, to analyze our peaking and tapering strategies, both just from a like program standpoint, but then also on an individual level. Um, so I think that controlled nature, it's definitely not for everybody from a like athlete standpoint, but it also um, does allow us to provide what I think is very practical and valuable information, that is hopefully impactful for how coaches um, help prepare their athletes.
Yeah, and I have the first study you mentioned, the survey of barbell trajectory and
Mhm.
kinematics of the snatch lift from the 2015 Worlds
Yep.
and 2017 Pan American Weightlifting Championship. So I
Mhm.
have that, and
Yep.
I'll link that one below. Now, the
Cool.
one looking at the questionnaire, was
Yep.
that, do you remember the title off the top of your
I
head, or can
think
you send that
it's
to me?
I think it's still in the review process, so
Gotcha.
it's not out yet or hasn't made it out yet. Um, but there are other studies, looking at where we publish some of our athlete monitoring data to answer specific research questions, similar, like not exactly the tapering one, but I mean, there's others that I could send over to you that would probably be interesting to some of the listeners.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll link whatever I have down below so people
Yep.
can check all of that out. And to specifically look at the study where you recorded all the lifts and examined the trajectories of the lifts, and then kind of put them in different buckets, right? Different
Mhm.
types of bar trajectory. What were the findings, if you can kind of detail them for us? But was there anything surprising about what you found, given that you had such a detailed look at so many lifts from so
Mhm.
many high level athletes?
Yeah. So I guess the big takeaway, the TLDR version, is that you can be successful at the highest level using pretty much any type of trajectory. Right? It's not trajectory per se that dictates whether or not you're going to be a good lifter. And so, what I think one of the extensions from that is, not to get like too mired in like the actual numbers. So there's 4 different trajectory types based off of the literature from Vorobiev and Hiskia, which are detailed in the paper. Um, but historically, I think it was the type 1 trajectory was considered like the best, most ideal version of the barbell trajectory, which is what Vorobiev suggested. And as you move from the 70s through the 80s and 90s, you started to see the prevalence within these elite competitions. More and more athletes started to exhibit the type 2 trajectory. And then you started to see the type 3 trajectory creep in more, at the top level. And this includes, men of all weight classes, women, you know, medal winners, focusing only on the gold medalists from each weight class, all that sort of stuff. And so, what's interesting, and what to me these findings indicate, is that historically, barbell trajectory was taken to be like an indicator of quote unquote good technique or
Mm,
bad technique. Like if you exhibited the type 3 trajectory, you were a bad weightlifter, right? Like get off the platform sort of thing. Um, but what I think the body of literature and the results from my study indicate is that you can be a good weightlifter with any of these trajectory types. So it's almost as if trajectory by itself
mm,
doesn't necessarily tell you if a weightlifter is good or bad, right? Like if you just saw the tracing of two different trajectories, you would have no idea if that came from like a gold medalist at the world championships or someone who just picked up the barbell for the first time. The only thing that you could use to differentiate those two lifters would be the actual weight on the bar.
mm,
Um, so I think that's a big point, and like we can unpack that quite a bit. But um, outside of that, what was surprising was how few variables. So we analyzed, gosh, I think maybe close to a dozen individual variables related to the barbell displacement, in addition to the barbell trajectory, and there was not like one single or not even a group of variables that was consistently different
mm,
across all the different comparisons that we made. The only variables, if I remember correctly, that seemed to like have a consistent difference were that the men's heavyweight and super heavyweight, so the 105 and plus 105 um, lifters, they had a smaller horizontal displacement after the second pull. So when they complete the second pull, the barbell loops away and then it comes back toward you as you move overhead into the catch. So that horizontal distance of how much the bar kicked away from them was less,
mm,
if I remember correctly, than some of the lower people who lifted less weight. Um, and then also the total amount of loops. So from that forward most distance from the second pull to where they actually caught it, so how much it moved back to the catch was also less among those weight categories. So it seemed to be that the more you can control the horizontal displacement during that second pull, that turnover, and that catch, um, those were the variables that were associated with the people who lifted the most amount of weight,
mm,
right? So, um, from the standpoint of why that was the case, it's hard to say. But I think if you look at all of the different factors, and again, going back to if you were to look at two bar tracings, you wouldn't know the difference between if it was lifter A or lifter B. But if you looked at the weight, um, you could say lifter A was stronger, or lifter B was stronger. So from the same standpoint, the people who were the strongest seemed to have the least amount or reduced amount of horizontal displacement. Now, is that correlation, causation? I don't know, but at least gives some guidance from the standpoint of if you're going to focus on something. Like, I'm not saying I wouldn't try to teach a specific type of technique, but I wouldn't get or trajectory, but I wouldn't get hung up on it with an athlete. Like some of that stuff is just due to limb length ratios and that sort of stuff. Body mass, um, and things like that. But I would definitely try to focus on making sure you control the bar during the second pull and that turnover,
mm.
making sure you're focusing on keeping the bar close and that sort of stuff. So,
Yeah, and I think I really liked the conclusion of that paper that talked about, and I don't know, I hear this a lot, and I wasn't sure if it was really well supported besides anecdote, but that the initial stage of learning the lift is very very critical, and then after that it's kind of a refinement because the technique that's taught initially tends to stick uh, pretty aggressively, so it's hard to make wholesale changes. Is
mhm.
that kind of the same idea? It's like develop the technique you can, make it as efficient as you can, however you would kind of define that, and then supplement it with strength work in just developing the ability to produce force and produce force rapidly.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. That's a spot on assessment. I think within weightlifting specifically, there's limited evidence. There's some evidence, but not a lot, admittedly, to support that notion that once you develop your technique, like that's your technique. Um, like you said, anecdotally, I think we can all appreciate that and like have experienced that ourselves, or like even trying to coach an athlete, through some sort of technique change, like, oh, this feels weird, or once it gets to a certain weight, they just like right back to whatever their old habits were. But I think within like motor learning, motor control, outside of weightlifting, there's enough to reasonably support that concept from that notion as well. Um, and so, yeah, I think it makes a, a really important implication for coaches, especially those working with younger athletes or athletes that are earlier in their training history or their career. Like, if that's true, that the technique that you have developed at the earlier stages are what you carry with you throughout the rest of your lifting days, like, that makes it even more important to make sure that you establish good sound technique during those early stages, so that you're not trying to fight against the grain later on and trying to change these bad habits and these bad techniques. um, and then once you establish that good technique, like I said, it's just about getting stronger, like about being able to lift more weight. And whether that's, you think you need more leg strength backs or whatever the case may be, like we can go down a programming, LTAD rabbit hole if you wanted to. But like, to me, the logical conclusion is that if it's not barbell trajectory and there's no consistent technical difference between weight classes, between world championship versus Pan Am championships within my study, but then even throughout the whole body of weightlifting literature, there is no consistent difference, or pattern that we can identify. If you look at all the different metrics and variables that have been investigated, um, then what is it? Well, like, the simplest answer to me is just like the physical characteristics and qualities are what differentiate people who can lift a lot versus not lift a lot. And sure, the technique has to support their ability to lift that. But again, once you have good technique, or you have reasonable technique, the only thing that's going to get you from point A to point B of lifting more weight is that physical development piece.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've been going for a while now, so my question to kind of help wrap us up, and you've gotten a bit away from this, given that now you've taken on more of a role at the UFCPI. Where would you like to see research in the field of sports science headed to help provide coaches, provide practitioners, and provide scientists with a better understanding of um, I guess whatever you kind of are involved with, that's kind of where you're going to be looking. But where would you like to see the research headed to help
Sure.
support coaches?
Um, I think I think we would all do ourselves a favor if we could just like take a moment and step back and not put the cart before the horse. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times within research, but then even on the practitioner side, where okay, we see this VBT device came out, or this technology came out, so I'm going to use it. And it's like, we start to get ahead of ourselves, where we identify something that we're going to use, or we identify a study that we want to do without first identifying like what we're trying to accomplish. Like, why are we going to use this? Like, what about my coaching practice is this going to benefit, or what bottleneck is this going to help alleviate from a research standpoint? What practical application could this possibly have? Like, what gap in the literature within the scientific knowledge does this actually fill? Um, I don't think we spend enough time on those sorts of questions. So for me, I think really I would just like to see um, more deliberate question asking. And again, that goes for both the researchers and the practitioners. And I think that's why we shoot ourselves in the foot and create a lot of undue frustration, especially from the practitioner side. Um, I know it's a little bit different within like weightlifting coaching. It's a lot more like a smaller, more individual basis, like smaller gyms. But on the like within professional sport, or even collegiate sport, some of these larger organizations where you have the resources to invest in different tools and technologies, um, where you get people that do invest financially and they don't see a return on their investment. Like, things aren't getting better, or they're not able to answer questions any better than they were without that technology because they never took the time to
Mm.
figure out what questions they're trying to ask to begin with. Um, so not really a direct answer to your question, but that's my answer.
No, that was actually a better answer, and it brings back a quote I heard on the podcast called On Coaching with Steve Magnus and I think it's John Marcus, but they were saying like you shouldn't measure something if you can't do anything with the information. Like
Yep.
it's completely meaningless to have, and I've seen that in my own practice, and I think that's kind of rampant now in this like whole data driven, data forward
Yeah.
approach. And I don't know if this is unique to weightlifting, but like remote coaching, all this stuff, they're trying to measure everything they can measure,
Hmm.
and if you can't use it to inform practice, I don't see the value. So
Yeah. No, 100%. And the thing too, like a lot of a lot of these devices give a lot of different measurements, right? And but if you don't already know what measurement to focus in on or to hone in on, then you're just kind of like lost in the sea of numbers and variables. But if you know what you're after, like you can go direct to that and just ignore all the noise. Like, yeah, you get all this information, but you know that you can ignore it and that you're not
mm,
losing or missing out on it, and you're actually able to focus on extracting the value that you can get out of that device or that tool. So, um, yeah, it's definitely easy to overwhelm yourself with extra information. That what do you do with it?
right. And I know just from my personal experience, I don't think you're one for social media much. But if people want to either read your work or I don't know if
Sure.
people ever bite on this, but get in contact about podcasts or conversation or
Yeah.
something, where can we direct them to find all that?
Sure. I'm not good about being active on social media. I'm more active on Twitter. I do have an Instagram account. They're both the same handle. It's at Aaron J. Cunanan. Um, so you can connect with me on there. Like I said, I am more active on Twitter. If you do try to contact me on there, I'll message you back. Happy to connect with anyone. If you want to email me, it's just aaron.cunanan@gmail.com. So always happy to chat and connect with anybody, despite my inactivity on social media. So yeah, whether it's you need access to a research paper that I've been a part of, any questions or any follow up or anything like that, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. And for everyone listening, you can find me the same place at Josh_Phil WL on Instagram. That's PHILWL. You can find the club at Clintonville Barbell. You can subscribe on YouTube at Philosophical Weightlifting. That's enough of the shameless plugs. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed the episode, and we will catch you next week.